Welcome back to Dirty Laundry, the place where we do not just air the secrets, we deep clean them. Everyone has a little something they want to hide, a stain they cannot quite wash out. But here we totally embrace the mess. We dive into the most scandalous stories, hidden truths, and ultimate unfiltered drama. Grab your popcorn, sit back, and get ready. Because today our cycle is about to spin out of control. Do not forget to hit that subscribe button before we uncover what is really in the basket. On the morning my wife disappeared, I found a flash drive hidden under the cargo liner of her truck. Inside were two folders. The first was labeled Harlan. The second was labeled Danny. Danny was my son. He had been dead for 8 years. I had believed, until that morning, that he died in a car accident. I was wrong about that. And I was wrong about a great deal else besides. I was married for 24 years to a woman I thought I knew completely. She sat across from me at breakfast every morning. She left the kitchen light on when she expected me home late. I did not find out until she went missing on a Friday night in October. What she had been carrying alone for 3 years, and what it would take from a 62-year-old mechanic to bring her home. This is where it started. I woke up at 2 a.m. on a Friday in October, and I knew something was wrong before I even opened my eyes. It was the temperature. Margaret runs warm. She always has. 24 years of sleeping beside her, and I had grown so used to the warmth of her that the cold on her side of the bed hit me like a window left open in winter. I lay still for a moment, listening. The house was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a sleeping home, but the wrong kind. The kind that settles in your chest and will not move. I called her name once, then again. Nothing came back but the slow turn of the ceiling fan overhead. I checked every room, the bathroom, the kitchen, the back porch where she liked to drink her coffee on cool mornings. All empty. The kitchen light was on the way she always left it when she expected me home after dark. It had burned on for me 10,000 times over the years. That night, it just looked lonely. I tried her cell phone 4 times. Each time it rang to voicemail. Her voice said she would call back soon. I had heard that recording so many times it had gone invisible to me, the way a picture on the wall disappears after a while. Standing in the empty kitchen at 2 a.m, I listened to it like I was hearing it for the first time. I am not a man who falls apart easily. 62 years of living will settle that in you. I served overseas at 19. I came home and built a repair shop from $800 and my father's tools. I raised a son named Danny who had my hands and his mother's laugh. And I buried that same son 8 years ago after an accident on Cedar Road took him at 19. I know what real fear feels like. I know how to stand inside it. But this was different. This was Margaret. I grabbed my jacket and drove out into the dark. I drove out into Millhaven with the windows down. 15,000 people. One main street. The kind of quiet at 2 a.m. where every sound carries farther than it should. I drove slow, watching the edge of the road. I found her truck about half a mile from the house, pulled off onto the shoulder of Old Creek Road like it had just quietly stopped on its own. The engine was still running. I could hear it idling from 30 feet away. The driver's door was hanging open, and the interior light was throwing a pale yellow shape out onto the asphalt. I pulled up behind it and got out. Her purse was on the passenger seat. Her phone was inside it. Her reading glasses were folded on the center console the way she always set them when she was not wearing them. The radio was on the station she listened to in the evenings, the one that played old country songs. Something slow and quiet was coming out of the speakers into the empty cab. Everything was there. Everything except her. For 24 years, I had gone out every morning and started that truck before Margaret was out of bed. Rain or shine, without exception. It was a small thing. One of those small things that becomes the backbone of a marriage without you ever deciding it should. I stood on that road for a long time. The night was warm the way Georgia nights hold their heat into October. Somewhere down the road, a dog was barking at something it could not see. I thought about Danny. Cedar Road was less than a mile from where I was standing, and the mind always finds its darkest places first. Danny had gone down that road on a clear September morning 8 years ago and had not come back. No rain, no ice, no reason anyone could ever explain to me in a way that felt like the truth. Just a young man and an empty road, and then nothing. I pushed the thought down and looked up and down Old Creek Road one more time. Then I took out my phone and called the one man in Millhaven I thought to call at 2 in the morning when something was wrong. I had known Boyd Harlan for 16 years. He had been the county sheriff for every one of them. I had voted for him 4 straight elections. He had come to Danny's funeral and stood beside me at the graveside in the September heat, and told me that if I ever needed anything, I only had to ask. I had believed him when he said it. He picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice steady and alert in a way that told me he had not been sleeping. I told him where I was. I told him about Margaret. I told him about the truck and the open door and the purse on the seat like she had only stepped away for a moment. He was quiet after I finished. Then he said he was on his way and that I should not touch anything. I stood there in the dark beside my wife's idling truck and waited for the lights of his cruiser to come down the road. The sky above me was full of stars. Margaret would have liked that. She always liked the stars. I had no idea. Standing there in the quiet of that October night, that the man I had just called was the reason she was gone. The lights came down Old Creek Road about 12 minutes after I made the call. I watched them from where I was standing, one hand resting on the roof of Margaret's truck. 2 sets of headlights moving at a pace that was fast enough to mean it was serious, but not fast enough to mean anyone thought a life was in immediate danger. That distinction registered with me, but I did not know what to do with it yet. Boyd Harlan stepped out of the first cruiser. He was in plain clothes, dark jacket, jeans, boots like he had pulled on whatever was closest to the door. I noted that. If someone wakes you out of a dead sleep, you dress in a hurry. Harlan looked like a man who had gotten dressed with time to spare. He walked toward me with his hands open at his sides, the way you approach someone you want to reassure. And he put his hand on my shoulder before he said a word. His grip was firm and steady. It was the grip of a man who had done this before and knew exactly how much pressure to apply. "Ray," he said, "tell me everything." I told him again what I had already told him on the phone. The truck on the shoulder of Old Creek Road, the engine running, The door open, her purse on the seat. He listened with his head slightly bowed, nodding at the right moments, his face arranged into the expression of a man who was taking this very seriously. His deputy walked the perimeter of the truck with a flashlight. A second deputy stayed by the cruiser and wrote things down in a notepad. Harlan looked around at the dark road, then back at me. "She have any reason to stop out here?" he asked. "Meet somebody. Maybe take a walk. Margaret does not take walks at 2 in the morning." I said. He nodded like that was the answer he expected. "I know that, buddy. I am just covering all the ground. You know, I think of you two like family. I am going to find her and bring her home. You have my word on that. I have heard Boyd Harlan give his word on things many times over the years. He delivered it the same way every time, with eye contact and a slight forward lean, like the words were coming from somewhere deep rather than somewhere practiced. I had always found it reassuring, standing on that road at 2 in the morning with the dew coming in off the fields. I noticed for the first time that I did not feel reassured at all. He told me to go home and try to get some rest. He said his people would process the scene and start canvassing. He said I should call him if I thought of anything, and that he would call me the moment he had news. I told him I wanted to tow Margaret's truck to my shop. It was a repair shop, I said. I would feel better having it somewhere secure rather than left on a county road. Harlan looked at the truck for a moment, then back at me. He said that was fine. He said his deputy would note the vehicle's condition before I moved it. The deputy with the flashlight walked around the truck one more time, called out that everything looked undisturbed, and Harlan said that was good enough. I hooked up the tow line myself. I did not need help, and I did not want any. My hands knew the work without thinking about it, the way hands do after 40 years. And the routine of it kept me from going somewhere inside my head I was not ready to go yet. I drove the 12 minutes back to my shop with Margaret's truck riding behind me and Millhaven sleeping on either side of the road. The shop smelled the way it always smells at that hour. Motor oil and metal shavings and the kind of quiet that only belongs to a closed garage. I pulled Margaret's truck inside under the fluorescent lights, and in that flat white light it looked different than it had on the road. Smaller somehow, more ordinary. A 10-year-old silver pickup with a cracked side mirror I had been meaning to replace since spring. I walked around it once before I opened anything. Old habit from 40 years of doing this. When a car comes into your shop, you look at the whole thing before you start pulling it apart. You let your eyes go where they want to go. Sometimes they find things your hands would have missed. My eyes went to the bed of the truck first. The cargo liner was not sitting right. It was flush along the sides and flush along the front. But the back left corner was sitting just slightly higher than it should have been. Maybe 1/4 of an inch. Maybe less. Most people would not have noticed it. After 40 years of working on vehicles, I noticed it the way you notice when a picture frame is crooked on a wall you have walked past 1,000 times. I stood there for a moment, looking at it, with my arms at my sides. Then I reached in, slowly, and lifted the corner of the liner. The USB drive was tucked into the space between the liner and the bed wall, sealed inside a small, clear zip bag, wrapped twice in black electrical tape. It was no bigger than my thumb. It had been placed deliberately, not dropped, not forgotten. Someone had put it there and put it there carefully, exactly where a mechanic would find it, and nobody else would think to look. I stood in my shop at 4 in the morning, under the flat fluorescent lights, with that small sealed bag in my hand. And I knew with complete certainty that whatever was on it was the reason Margaret was gone. The USB drive was still inside its zip bag when I set it on the edge of my workbench, next to the old laptop I kept in the office for invoices and parts orders. I sat down in the rolling chair and looked at it for a long moment. My hands were steady. My heart was going like I had run a flight of stairs. I opened the bag, wiped the drive on my shirt, and plugged it in. The laptop was slow the way old machines are slow, taking its time thinking through the request. When the folder finally opened, I leaned forward in my chair. There were more files on that drive than I expected. Hundreds of them, sorted into folders, organized the way a person organizes things when they intend to find them again. The first folder had a single word on the label, Harlan. I opened it. The photographs loaded one at a time in the gray pre-dawn light coming through the office window. The first few were taken from a distance, at night, using some kind of long lens. They showed the back end of a flatbed truck on a rural road I did not recognize, its cargo area covered with a dark tarp. There were shapes under the tarp. The shapes were the wrong shape for farm equipment or freight. The timestamps on the photos read somewhere between 11 at night and 2 in the morning on dates spread across the past 3 years. I kept scrolling. There were documents mixed in among the photographs, lists of names, dozens of them, mostly Spanish, with dates beside each one. Some names had a small notation in Margaret's handwriting that I recognized after 38 years of reading her grocery lists and birthday cards, and reminder notes left on the kitchen counter. The notation was a single word missing. There were maps, printouts of county road maps with certain properties circled in red pen. Most of the circles were farms out along Route 9 and the old Harlan Mill Road. I knew that territory. I had driven those roads 10,000 times. Some of those properties I had been to personally, over the years, for machine work. I was so focused on the screen that I did not hear the side door open. Morning. Ray, Pete Dawson had been working out of my shop for almost as long as I had owned it. 30 years we had been friends. The kind of friends who do not need to explain themselves to each other. He walked in the same way he always walked in, early, moving straight to the small coffee maker on the shelf by the tool wall without breaking stride. "Margaret get home all right?" he asked, filling the reservoir at the utility sink. "She did not come home," I said. He turned around. His face did the right things. Concern, a furrowing of the brow, the slight parting of the lips that means a person is genuinely surprised by what they just heard. He said he was sorry. Said, "What do you mean?" Said, "When did this happen?" And I gave him the short version. The truck on the road, the open door, Harlan coming out to take a look. Pete shook his head slowly through all of it, the way a man does when he is absorbing bad news. The coffee maker started its cycle, and he came over and looked at the laptop screen. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Files I found in the truck." I left it at that. He looked at the screen a moment longer than I would have expected him to. Then he said, "Find anything useful in there?" Something about the way he said it stayed with me. Not the words themselves, but the pace of them. Slightly too casual, the way a question sounds when a person has been waiting to ask it. I filed it away without examining it, and told him I did not know yet. He went back to the coffee. I went back to the screen. There was a photograph toward the bottom of the Harlan folder that stopped me. It was taken at one of the farms I recognized, a property out on Route 9 I had been to twice in the past 5 years for combine work. The Kellerman place. In the foreground of the photograph, clearly visible on the side of a metal outbuilding, was a painted logo. a red K inside a circle. I had seen that logo on invoices and equipment for years. I sat back in my chair and looked at the Kellerman name at the bottom of the image. Then I scrolled to the top of the drive and looked at the list of folders again. The second folder had one word on it, Danny. I have said already that I am not a man who falls apart easily. That is true. But I sat in that rolling chair in my shop at 4:30 in the morning, with Pete moving around quietly behind me and the coffee starting to smell the way coffee smells. And I looked at my son's name on that screen, and I did not move for a long time. Danny had been 19 years old. He had my hands, the same wide palms and short fingers that Margaret always said were made for working on things. He had her laugh, the kind that came out of nowhere and filled whatever room he was in. He had been 19 years old, and then he had not been anything at all, and I had spent 8 years learning to carry that fact without bending under the weight of it. I did not open the folder. My phone buzzed on the workbench beside me. Unknown number. I almost did not answer it. Then I picked up. The voice on the other end was a woman's, low and careful, speaking just above a whisper. "Mr. Holloway," she said. "My name is Clara Webb. Your wife told me that if anything ever happened to her, I should call you. Please do not tell anyone I contacted you. Can you meet me today?" I told the woman on the phone that I could meet her at noon. She gave me the name of a place 20 miles outside Millhaven, and I wrote it on the back of my hand. Then I sat at my workbench long enough to drink half a cup of Pete's coffee and listened to Pete move around in the shop behind me. When he stepped outside to check the oil delivery in the side yard, I walked out to my truck and drove north. Route 9 at dawn is a different road than Route 9 in daylight. The mist comes off the fields in the early morning and sits low across the asphalt, and the farms along the eastern stretch look the way old things look when they are not yet being watched. I had driven this road in every season for 40 years. I knew every curve and every property line. I knew which gates were always open and which ones were padlocked even during harvest. The Kellerman place was the fourth farm on the left past the water tower. I parked on the gravel shoulder a quarter-mile back and sat in my truck for a few minutes, watching. There were vehicles near the main barn that I had not seen on my previous visits. A large panel truck with no markings, 2 older pickup trucks with muddy plates, figures moving between the outbuildings in the gray morning light. Too many figures for this time of day on a working farm. I started the truck and drove up to the main gate. A man I did not recognize came out of the equipment shed before I had shut the engine off. He was younger than Kellerman, broad through the shoulders, and he looked at my truck the way a man looks at something he has been told to watch for. I said I was Ray Holloway from Holloway Repair. I said I had done some combine work for Kellerman a few years back, and I was in the area and wondered if they had anything that needed looking at before the next growing season. The man went inside. A few minutes later, Gerald Kellerman came out. I had met Kellerman 3 or 4 times over the years. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly. The kind of farmer who talked about weather and equipment and nothing else. That morning he did not look like himself. He stood at the edge of the equipment shed with his arms crossed and his eyes moving between me and the lane behind my truck, the way an animal's eyes move when it is considering whether it has a way out. He said he did not have any work right now. He said they were fully staffed and things were running fine. He said it in a way that was not rude but was very clearly a dismissal. And when I started to ask a follow-up question about the panel truck by the barn, he said he had to get back inside. I drove back down the lane and turned onto Route 9. In my rearview mirror, I watched Kellerman take out a phone and start dialing before I had even made the turn. I pulled off onto a fire road about a half-mile down and parked under the trees. I sat there with the window down and the engine off and thought about what I had seen, the number of people on that property, the way Kellerman had looked at me, the way that young man had come out of the shed already watching. I was still sitting there 20 minutes later when someone knocked on the passenger window. He was a young man, maybe 25, thin, with the kind of worn look that comes from outdoor work and not enough sleep. He held his hands up when I looked at him, palms out, the universal sign for I am not a threat. I unlocked the door. He got in. His name was Esteban. His English was careful and deliberate, the English of a person who had learned it out of necessity rather than choice. He said he had seen my truck at the gate and had recognized the name on the side. He said a woman had told him once that if anything ever went wrong, a man named Holloway at the repair shop was someone he could trust. I asked him what woman. He said her name was Miss Margaret. The teacher. I kept my face still and asked him to tell me what he needed to tell me. He talked for 15 minutes. He told me about the work conditions on the Kellerman property and on 2 other farms along Route 9. No wages paid, or wages that existed only on paper. Documents confiscated on arrival. Workers who tried to leave were returned by county law enforcement, not helped by it. He said this had been going on for at least 4 years. He said everyone knew which deputy to call if you wanted a man brought back. Then he told me about a man named Miguel. Miguel had gotten out 8 months ago. He had found his way to Miss Margaret's evening English class and told her everything. 3 days after that, Miguel died in a car accident on a back road outside of town. Single vehicle. No witnesses. The investigating officer had been Boyd Harlan. Esteban looked at me when he said the name. He watched my face the way people watch a face when they are not sure how much of the truth it can hold. I thanked him. I told him to go back the way he came and to be careful. He was out of the truck and moving through the tree line before I had finished the sentence. I sat in the silence for a long time after he was gone. Outside. The mist had burned off Route 9 and the morning had gone flat and bright. Everything looked the same as it always had. The fields, the tree line, the road curving south toward Millhaven. None of it was the same at all. I pulled the USB drive out of my shirt pocket and plugged it into the adapter I kept in the glove box. I had stopped scrolling through the Harlan folder when I recognized the Kellerman logo. I had not finished. That was not like me. I do not leave a job half done. I opened the folder again on my phone and kept going. The photograph was about 2/3 of the way down the folder. It was different from the others. Not a surveillance shot taken with a long lens in the dark. This one had been taken at close range, at night, at what looked like a private outdoor gathering. String lights were visible overhead. There were people in the background, men in collared shirts holding glasses. The kind of gathering that gets called a cookout, but is really about something else. In the center of the frame, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at whoever held the camera, were Boyd Harlan and Gerald Kellerman. I had seen Harlan at county functions dozens of times over 16 years. I had seen him shake hands with farmers and business owners and school board members. I had never seen him look the way he looked in that photograph. Not like a public official at a community event. Like a man celebrating something with his partners. I kept scrolling. The financial documents were harder to read on a phone screen, but the numbers were large enough to be clear even on a small display. Transfers between accounts I did not recognize. A ledger, handwritten in columns, with dates going back 6 years. Names in the margin that I recognized. A county commissioner. A state road inspector whose name I had seen on a building permit years ago. The chief of the county agricultural board. This was not a corrupt sheriff taking money to look the other way. This was an organization. Harlan was not a participant. He was the center of it. I sat there on that fire road with my phone in my hand and tried to think about when I had first voted for Boyd Harlan. 19 years ago. He had run on a platform of community values and accountability. He had won by a wide margin and won again every time after that. Somewhere in those 19 years, while I was fixing trucks and going to church and coaching Little League, he had been building this, right here, in the county where I was born. My phone buzzed. A text from the unknown number. A name and an address. Nothing else. The Crossroads Diner on State Road 41. I knew the place. I had driven past it 100 times without ever stopping. 20 minutes from where I was sitting. I put the truck in gear. The Crossroads Diner was the kind of place that exists at the edge of every small county in the South, where the road widens before narrowing again, and there is always a gas station on the other side. The parking lot held 6 vehicles when I pulled in. None of them new. I sat in my truck for a moment and watched the door. Then I went inside. She was in the back corner booth, the one with the wall on 2 sides and a clear line of sight to both the front entrance and the hallway to the restrooms. She had chosen it deliberately. She was somewhere in her mid-40s. Dark hair pulled back, wearing a jacket over a plain shirt. She was drinking coffee and she did not look up from the table when the bell above the door rang. She waited until I was halfway across the room before she raised her eyes. I sat down across from her. "My name is Clara Webb," she said quietly. "I am an investigative journalist. I have been working with your wife for the past 14 months. I asked her how she knew Margaret. She said that Margaret had reached out to her after Miguel died. She had read one of Clara's earlier pieces about agricultural labor violations in the eastern part of the state and had contacted her through the paper. They had been exchanging information carefully, through channels that were difficult to trace. Ever since. "Tell me about Margaret," I said. Clara looked at me the way a person looks at someone they are deciding how much to trust. Then she made her decision and started talking. She said Margaret had been collecting evidence for almost 4 years before she contacted Clara. She had started the evening English classes 2 years before that, which meant she had been doing this work for 6 years total, quietly, without telling anyone. Building relationships with the men and women who came through the farms along Route 9, learning their names, learning what had happened to them, writing it all down. Clara said Margaret had known for at least a year that Harlan was aware someone was gathering information. She said Margaret had been careful about it, methodical. The kind of careful that comes from understanding exactly what you are up against and deciding to continue anyway. She said there had been moments when Margaret could have stopped, when it would have been safer to let it go. She had not let it go. I thought about the woman I knew, the one who left a light on for me every night, who packed lunches for children who could not speak English, who stayed late to help people who were afraid to ask for assistance. I had thought of those things as simply who she was. I had not understood until now that they were choices. Clara Webb looked across the table at me and said, "Your wife is the bravest woman I have ever met, Mr. Holloway, and the most careful. Every move she made for a reason, including the ones you do not understand yet." I asked her what she meant by that. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at me for a long moment. "There is something about the truck you need to know," she said. Clara set both hands flat on the table and looked at me in the way a person looks when they are about to say something they have rehearsed. She did not break the transmission by accident. "Mr. Holloway," I looked at her. I said, "What do you mean?" She said it plainly, without softening it. Margaret broke that transmission herself. She needed the truck to stop at that point on Old Creek Road. She needed it to stop close enough to your house that you would find it quickly and far enough from the driveway that no one watching the house would see it from the road. She needed you to be the one to bring it into the shop. I sat back in the booth and looked at the table. She planned it, Clara said. All of it. The location, the timing, the USB. She knew that if something happened to her, the evidence would need to be in the hands of someone who could not be threatened or bought off. She chose you. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "She knew she was going to be taken." Clara looked at her coffee. She said, "She knew it was a possibility she had to plan for." She had been watching Harlan's people get closer for about 3 weeks. She did not know exactly when it would happen or how, but she knew it was coming. And she needed to make sure that when it did, the evidence did not disappear with her. I thought about something then. I had not thought about it in years. About 8 months ago, on a Sunday afternoon when we were out in the garage together, Margaret had asked me to show her how a transmission worked. She said she wanted to understand the mechanical side of things, just generally. I had shown her. I had shown her the way the fluid circulates, the way the torque converter operates, the way a single small bolt in the valve body, if removed, will cause the transmission to fail gradually and quietly over the course of several days rather than all at once, so that the driver does not know anything is wrong until the truck is already where it needs to be. She had asked about that specific bolt. She had asked which one it was and how difficult it was to reach. I had shown her. I had thought nothing of it at the time. I looked down at my hands on the table. Wide palms, short fingers, 40 years of grease and oil worked into the lines of them. I thought about how many times Margaret had held those hands. How many times she had looked at them without me knowing. She was calculating what they could teach her. The hands that had shown my wife exactly how to brake her own truck. She trusted you completely, Clara said quietly. She did not tell you what she was doing because she did not want to put you in danger. But she built her entire contingency plan around the assumption that if she left the right thing in the right place, you would find it and you would know what to do with it. I said, she could not have known I would bring the truck to the shop instead of leaving it for Harlan's people to process, Clara said. She knew you. She said that if there was one thing she was certain of, it was that Ray Holloway would not leave his wife's truck on the side of the road in the middle of the night. She said you would take it somewhere you controlled. She knew it would be the shop. I sat there for a while with that. Margaret had been planning for her own disappearance. She had been planning for the possibility of her own death, quietly, methodically, while cooking dinner and watching television and sleeping beside me in the dark. She had not told me because telling me would have put me in the path of the same danger she was already walking through. Every morning she had sat across from me at the kitchen table and handed me my coffee and asked how I had slept. And the whole time she had been carrying this, carrying it alone so that I would not have to. So instead, she had done the only thing she could. She had left a trail she knew I could follow. I asked Clara if Margaret had known she would survive. Clara said she did not know. She said Margaret had never talked about survival as a certainty. She had talked about it the way a person talks about something they hope for but cannot count on. I let that settle. Then Clara reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and placed a small envelope on the table between us. It was a standard white envelope, unsealed, with my name written on the front in Margaret's handwriting. Margaret had expected me to open it. "There is one more thing," Clara said. "That envelope has a note inside. Margaret asked me to give it to you after I told you about the truck, not before." I looked at the envelope. I did not pick it up right away. "What does it say?" I asked. Clara shook her head. She said she did not know. She said Margaret had written it privately and sealed it herself before handing it to Clara to keep. Then she corrected herself and said it was not sealed. It was just folded. And that was how Margaret had given it to her. I picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded once. On it was a short handwritten note in Margaret's careful, even script. It said the second folder, "Open it now. You are ready." I reached into my shirt pocket and closed my hand around the USB drive. My coffee had gone cold sitting on the table. Outside the diner windows, the morning had fully arrived. I had 8 hours' worth of information in my hands and a folder I had not yet opened. I set my phone on the table and looked at it for a moment. Clara sat across from me without speaking. I opened the second folder. The first things in the Danny folder were photographs, not of Danny, of the road, of Cedar Road on a September morning 8 years ago. Before I had ever gotten the call, before the paramedics had arrived, before anyone had told me my son was dead. The photographs had been taken from the shoulder of the road, looking down at the scene from a slight elevation, the way a professional would position themselves to document a situation. Danny's truck was visible in the lower left corner of the frame, driver's side against the embankment. The angle was deliberate, technical. I opened the image properties on the first photograph. Date taken September 14th. Time 6:47 in the morning. The paramedics had arrived at 7:12. I had always been told that. I had the paperwork from the medical examiner's office somewhere in a box at home. The call had come to me at 7:21. I remembered the time because I had been in the middle of a job and I had looked at my watch when the phone rang and thought it was too early for a personal call. Harlan's people had been on Cedar Road 25 minutes before the ambulance. I kept looking. There was a file labeled Accident Report. I opened it. It was the original investigation document, signed at the bottom by Boyd Harlan in the same signature I had seen on county notices and community letters for 16 years. The conclusion read, "Single vehicle accident, driver error, road conditions nominal, no criminal elements present. Case closed." 3 pages, signed and closed the same day. I had always found it strange that the investigation had closed so quickly. I had told myself that was just how things worked in a small county, that there was not much to investigate when a young man drove off a road on a clear morning. I had accepted that explanation because I had not had another one to replace it with. I scrolled to the next section of the folder. These were different photographs. Smaller resolution, taken on a phone camera, the kind of quality you get in low light. They showed a flatbed truck on a dirt road, partially obscured by tree cover. The truck had no running lights. In one photograph, you could make out the shape of a tarp over the cargo area. The timestamp on the first phone photo read September 13th, the night before Danny died. 11:58 in the evening. I recognized the road in the background. It was Harlan Mill Road, about 2 miles from Cedar Road. Danny had been out that night. I had known that. He had texted me at 10:30 to say he was heading home from a friend's house and could be back late. He had never made it home. I had assumed he had simply taken a wrong turn in the dark, or that he had fallen asleep at the wheel. He had not fallen asleep at the wheel. He had seen those trucks. He had been 19 years old and curious. He had probably pulled off the road to get a better look, the way young men do when they see something that does not make sense late at night on a dirt road. He had taken photographs on his phone. And then the following morning, at the exact time recorded on those photographs, Boyd Harlan had been standing on Cedar Road. I sat with my phone in my hands and read through everything in the folder. The maintenance records Margaret had pulled for the flatbed truck, traced by plate number to a holding company connected to Kellerman Farms. A handwritten timeline in Margaret's handwriting laying out the sequence of events from that September night through the accident the following morning. A note at the bottom of the timeline in her careful script that read Boyd Harlan was first on the scene. No dashcam footage was ever submitted. No witnesses were interviewed. I read it twice. Then I closed the folder and set my phone face down on the table. Clara had not said a word. She was watching me the way a good doctor watches a patient after delivering a diagnosis. Present but still, not pushing. I looked at the table for a while. Outside the diner windows, a truck pulled in and out of the parking lot. Someone called out a name near the counter. The coffee maker on the far wall made the sound it makes when the cycle finishes. I have said already that I am not a man who falls apart easily. That held. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not feel rage in the way I had always imagined I would feel it if someone told me that my son's death had not been an accident. What I felt instead was something quieter than rage and far more permanent. The kind of cold that settles into a person and does not leave. I had spent 8 years believing that Danny's death was a senseless thing, a bad morning on a familiar road, the kind of loss that has no explanation because there is nothing to explain. I had built my grief around that absence of meaning. I had built a whole way of living around it. The early mornings in the garage, the long hours, the work that kept my hands occupied and my mind from going somewhere I could not come back from. All of it constructed around a story that was not true. There was meaning now. I just had not decided yet what to do with it. Clara said, softly, "I am so sorry." "Ray." I shook my head. I said, "Not yet." I reached across the table and laid 2 folded bills under my coffee cup. Then I picked up my phone and my keys and walked to the door. I drove home from the diner on autopilot. That is the only way I can describe it. I know I drove because I ended up at the house, but I could not tell you what route I took or what lights I stopped at or whether I passed anyone on the road. My body was handling the truck, and my mind was somewhere else entirely. Still sitting in that diner booth with the folder open in front of me. The kitchen light was still on when I got home. Margaret had left it on for me, the way she always did, except this time she was not inside waiting. The light had burned on out of habit. The house did it automatically now after 24 years, like it had been trained. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table and did not move for a long time. I thought about the photograph in the Danny folder, the one Clara had pulled up after I opened the envelope, a color photograph taken with a phone camera, showing the front end of Harlan's personal vehicle parked on Cedar Road at a specific time on a specific morning 8 years ago. The metadata was still in the file. The timestamp put Harlan at that location 16 minutes before the first official call came in, before anyone, officially, knew there was a scene to respond to. Harlan had been there before the call. Harlan had made the call. I sat at the kitchen table in my wife's kitchen, in the house we had shared for 24 years, and I tried to understand what it meant to have been wrong about something for 8 years. Not a small thing, not a misunderstanding about a date or a detail. 8 years of believing my son had died because of ice that was not there, or a deer that darted across the road, or just the random cruelty of a moment. 8 years of making my peace with an accident. There was no accident. I had shaken Boyd Harlan's hand at Danny's funeral. I remember that specifically because it was the last time in my adult life I had cried in front of another person, standing at that graveside in the September heat. And Harlan had put his hand on my shoulder and told me that if I needed anything, I only had to ask. And I had been grateful. I had thought that is the kind of man he is. Solid. Present when it counts. I have thought about that handshake a great deal since. I do not know what time I went to bed. I know that I lay on the left side and stared at the ceiling for a long time, and that the ceiling did not offer any useful information. There was one other night in my life that had felt like that one. The night I came back from overseas, the first night back in the States, lying in a motel room outside of Atlanta with the television on, and no ability to connect what was on the screen to anything that felt real. That night I had stayed awake until it was light enough to drive. Then I had gotten back in the car and kept going. There was nothing else to do. This night felt like that one. Too much information. No way to process it fast enough to sleep. I was at the shop by 6 in the morning. I made coffee on the hot plate in the back and stood at the workbench with the county road map still spread out from the night before, and I ran through everything I knew, in order, the way you do when you are trying to build a thing that will hold. Margaret had been working on Harlan for 6 years. She had started teaching evening English classes at the community center, which I had known about. and had used those classes to build relationships with immigrant workers in the county, which I had not. She had been collecting evidence of labor trafficking, financial fraud, and eventually, 3 years ago, the connection to Danny. She had been carrying all of it alone so that I could keep having ordinary mornings. She had left me the USB drive because something had gone wrong, because she needed me to know, finally, what she knew. I was still thinking through it when the side door opened and Pete Dawson came in. He had his coffee thermos and his work jacket and the same face he had worn every morning for 30 years. He set his thermos on his workbench, the one on the south wall that had been his for as long as I could remember, and looked at the county map and then at me. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I said. He poured his coffee and asked if I had heard anything about Margaret yet. His voice was level, concerned in the way that a friend's voice should be. He had known Margaret almost as long as I had. He had been at our wedding. He had stood at Danny's graveside 4 rows behind me and come to the house afterward and sat at that kitchen table and eaten the food that neighbors brought. I told him nothing new. He nodded and looked at his coffee and said he was sure she would turn up. I watched him pull on his work gloves and turn to the engine block he had been rebuilding for the past 2 weeks. And I thought about what it meant to know someone for 30 years and still not know them at all. About how a face can look the same on a Monday morning as it always has, while the person behind it is holding something you were never supposed to find out. I had learned something about that in the last 24 hours. I went back to my side of the shop, and I let him work. I spent the morning watching Pete the way I watch a vehicle I am not sure about. When something is wrong with a car but you cannot identify it yet, you do not throw yourself at the problem. You run the engine at idle. You listen. You let your eyes find what they keep returning to. Most of the time, the fault announces itself. If you give it enough time and quiet, I gave Pete time and quiet. He worked the way he always worked, moving between the bays with the unhurried competence of a man who has been doing the same thing for 30 years. He did not talk much in the mornings. Neither did I. That had always been one of the things I valued about him. But I noticed things. He checked his phone 3 times in the first 2 hours. Pete Dawson did not check his phone while he was working. He had said more than once that the phone was for after the job was done. He had given his son a hard time about it years ago. The way fathers do when they recognize a habit they do not like. He also positioned himself twice near the office window, the one that looks out on the side yard, in the kind of casual, purposeless way that is not actually casual or purposeless. And he had asked about Margaret again, just once, around 9:30 in the morning. Had I heard anything? Was Harlan's office keeping me updated? Had I talked to anyone else who might know something? Normal questions for a friend to ask, one by one, normal, in a line. With the phone checks and the window positioning, they added up to something different. I decided to run a diagnostic, around 10 in the morning, while Pete was under a truck in the second bay. I walked into the office doorway and said, casual, that I was thinking about driving over to talk to someone on Caldwell Road that afternoon. An older woman named Clara who said she knew Margaret, number 47. I said, across from the church, There was no one named Clara on Caldwell Road. There was no number 47 across from any church on that road. I had made up both the address and the name in the 10 seconds between deciding to test Pete and opening my mouth. Pete came out from under the truck and said that sounded like a good lead. He said he hoped it turned out to be useful. He said it in the tone of a man who was listening carefully and trying not to show it. I said I figured I would head over around 2 in the afternoon. Then I went back to work. For the next 3 hours, I changed out a water pump, replaced a set of brake pads on a pickup, and answered 3 customer calls. I did not think about Pete. I did not watch him. I let the work do what work has always done for me, which is to put something useful between my hands and my mind and keep the two from turning on each other. At 1:47 in the afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number. I already knew before I answered. It was Harlan. He said he had heard I might be heading over to Caldwell Road to talk to someone. He said he just wanted to check in, make sure I had everything I needed. He said if I wanted, he would send a deputy to come along, just to make sure I stayed safe. He was on Caldwell Road just then. He said, checking something out himself. And he could swing by number 47 if that would help. I said I appreciated that. I said I might take him up on it. Then I ended the call and set my phone face down on the workbench. I sat on the stool next to the bench and looked at the concrete floor for a while. I was doing the math. Harlan had made his call less than 2 hours after Pete had learned the address. Whatever the arrangement was between them, the information moved fast. Pete had been told to report in, and Pete had reported. I stood up and took my keys off the hook by the office door. Pete was at the coffee maker again. He had his back to me. He poured a mug without hurrying, the way a man does when he is trying to look like he is not paying attention to what is happening behind him. "Where are you headed?" he asked. His voice was even, careful. The voice of a man who already knew the answer and was hoping the answer would be something else. "Pete's house," I said. He set the mug down on the shelf. He did not say anything for a moment. He did not turn around right away. I watched his shoulders settle in the particular way shoulders settle when a person stops pretending to themselves that a thing is not going to happen. Then he turned around. He looked at me with the face of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been told he could put it down. Not relieved, exactly. Something more complicated than that. The expression of a person who is tired of the weight more than they are afraid of what comes after. I walked to the door. He followed. We drove separately. I watched his truck in my rearview mirror the whole way. He did not try to run. He did not try to call anyone. He just drove at a steady pace. 2 car lengths behind me, all the way to his street. There was something both sad and decent in that. The man knew what was coming and he came anyway. I parked at the curb in front of his house. He pulled in behind me. We got out at the same time. He walked to his front door and opened it and stepped to the side to let me in without either of us saying a word. Pete's living room was not what I expected, though I could not have told you what I expected. It was a normal room, a blue couch, a television that was too large for the space, a bookshelf with more picture frames than books on it. One of the photographs was Jimmy at his high school graduation, grinning the way boys grin when they do not yet know how much the world is going to ask of them. There was another one of Pete and Jimmy at a fishing spot I recognized. Pete's hand on Jimmy's shoulder, both of them squinting against the sun. Jimmy looked about 12 years old in that one. Pete sat in the armchair across from me with his hands on his knees. He was not crying yet. He was doing the thing people do when they are trying to hold themselves together long enough to get through what they have to say. I did not say anything. I had asked him enough questions already. He knew what was required. He started talking. He said Jimmy had been 22 when he was arrested. Not a kid anymore, legally, but still his kid in every way that mattered to Pete. The charge had been possession with intent, which carried a mandatory minimum sentence that would have put Jimmy away for 5 to 7 years. Pete had gone to 2 lawyers. Neither of them had offered him much hope. He said Harlan had come to him 3 days after the arrest, not at the station, at Pete's house. Pete had answered the door, and Harlan had come inside and sat in the same chair Pete was sitting in now and explained the situation in the quiet, reasonable way Harlan explained everything. He said he could make the charges disappear. He said Jimmy would be in some paperwork trouble, maybe lose his license for a year, but he would not go to prison. He said the only thing he would ask in return was that Pete keep him informed about the people Pete knew, about the things Pete heard. Pete said he had asked what Harlan meant by that specifically. Harlan had told him it meant Ray. He had not said it the way you say something sinister. He had made it sound like a minor administrative requirement. Just keep track of what Ray is doing, what he is hearing, who he is talking to. Nothing serious. Just so we all stay on the same page. Pete said he had told himself it was a small thing, that nothing bad would come of it, that it was a reasonable price to pay to keep his son out of a cell. He looked at me when he said that. He was not asking for absolution. He was just stating the mechanism by which a man who would have called himself decent had become something else. I know what I did, Pete said. I am not going to tell you I did not know. I knew. I just told myself the story that made it survivable. I asked him when it had started. 5 years ago, he said. Almost exactly 5 years. I thought about how many times in those 5 years I had stood next to Pete at the workbench and trusted him without questioning it. How many conversations. How many afternoons? How many times I had told him things because he was my oldest friend, and I did not think to be careful. 5 years was not a long time, and it was a very long time. It was long enough to have become ordinary, long enough that Pete probably did not think about what he was doing on most days. It had just become part of the structure of how he moved through the world. I didn't know he was going to take her. Pete said. His voice was different now. Thinner. When he told me you had been to the Kellerman farm and talked to someone out there. I didn't think. I just reported in. That was all I knew how to do by then. I thought it would be the same as every other time. A phone call, some information. Nobody gets hurt. His eyes were wet now. He did not wipe them. Harlan told me it was just to keep an eye on things. Pete said that nobody would get hurt. I believed him for a long time, longer than I should have. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked him the one question that mattered. Did you know about Danny? Pete looked at me. He was not composing himself or choosing his words. He just looked at me with an expression that had nothing left in it to protect. No, he said. I did not know about Danny. I did not know about any of it until you walked into my shop this morning, and I saw your face, and I understood that I had been part of something much larger than what Harlan had told me it was. I have spent 30 years reading Pete Dawson. I knew his tells. I knew the particular way his jaw tightened when he was shading something, and the way his eyes went just slightly to the left when he was constructing a version of events. None of those things were present now. He was telling the truth, which made it worse, in a specific way I had not anticipated. If Pete had known about Danny, I could have been simply and cleanly furious with him. What I felt instead was a sorrow that had no clean edges, for a man who had loved his son the only way he knew how, and had handed that love over to someone who turned it into a mechanism. I stood up. Pete did not stand. He stayed in the armchair with his hands on his knees, looking at the space between us where 30 years of friendship had just become something without a name. I walked to the door. I had my hand on the door handle of Pete Dawson's front door when I turned around one last time. Pete was still sitting in the armchair with his hands on his knees. He looked like a man who had confessed everything he had to confess and was now waiting, without any expectation of mercy, for whatever came next. I did not shout. I had thought I might when I was driving over here, but standing there in his living room with the afternoon light coming through the curtains, I understood that anger would not serve what I needed to say. Some things are too large for a raised voice, I said. You saved your boy, Pete. I understand that, but you helped him take mine. Then I turned and walked out and pulled the door shut behind me. Something had passed between Pete and me in that room that would not pass back. I sat in my truck in front of his house for a while. Late Saturday afternoon. Quiet the way a residential street gets quiet in the 2 or 3 hours before dinner. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler was going. 2 kids were riding bikes on the sidewalk on the other side of the street, cutting hard around a dip in the pavement the way kids do when they know every inch of their neighborhood. I thought about what I had to work with. I did not have a badge or a warrant or a single law enforcement officer I could call without the information reaching Harlan within the hour. I did not have 24 hours. I did not have anything that most people would consider an advantage in this situation. What I had was 40 years of knowing this county. Every road, every farm, every property that had changed hands or fallen into disuse or sat behind a tree line that the county maps did not accurately represent. I had driven those roads on service calls and in search of deer, and in the course of doing all the ordinary things a man does in the place he has decided to spend his life. That knowledge was in my bones. It was the one thing nobody had been able to take from me in the last 2 days. That was going to have to be enough. My phone rang. Clara. She told me the GB I had received the files and was moving through the verification process faster than she had hoped. She said they needed approximately 24 hours before they could legally move on anything. She said, "Ray, please do not try to do this alone." I told her I heard her. Then I ended the call and started the truck. 24 hours was more time than I had. It was more time than Margaret had. Those were the only terms that applied to my situation right now. I drove home and went straight to the bedroom. I had not been in the room since the night Margaret disappeared. The silence in it was different now. It had that quality a room gets when the person who gave it its character is no longer present. A kind of acoustic absence that has nothing to do with sound. I stood in it for a moment and let that land. Then I opened the closet and moved the winter coats to one side and reached to the back corner where the gun case had been sitting for as long as I could remember. The rifle was a .30 caliber bolt action that I had carried through the Mekong Delta when I was young and brought home when I came back. I had cleaned it every year since then out of the kind of discipline that becomes its own reason after long enough. It was in better condition than I was. I sat on the edge of the bed and ran a cloth over it the way I had 100 times. Danny had asked me about the rifle once, when he was about 14 years old. He had stood in this doorway and watched me the way he watched things he was trying to understand. With that patient, serious attention he had from a young age. He had asked what I kept it for. I told him it was from the war, that I kept it maintained out of habit and respect, that I hoped the day would never come when any of us needed to know what it was capable of. He had thought about that for a moment. He had the serious, considering way about him that some kids have from a young age, the kind that makes you think they are going to be worth knowing when they grow up. Hope that day never comes. "Dad," he had said. "Me too, son." I had said, "Me too." I set the rifle on the bed and sat with it for a little while after that. Danny had been gone for 8 years, and his voice in my memory was still completely clear. It would always be completely clear. Some things do not fade with time. They just find a way to coexist with everything else you are carrying. I looked at the room one more time before I left. The indentation in Margaret's pillow. The book she had been reading on the nightstand. Face down where she had set it the night before she disappeared. Keeping her place in a story she had not yet finished. I picked up the rifle, carried it to the truck, and drove to the shop. I spread the county map across the workbench under the fluorescent lights and started working through the properties I knew, looking for the one that fit. Old outbuildings. Enough tree cover to block road visibility. Within a reasonable distance from where Harlan operated. I had been at it for about 20 minutes and had reduced my list to 2 candidates when something knocked on the side door of the shop. 3 short raps. A pause. 2 more. I set the pencil down. I went to the side door and opened it. Esteban was standing outside in the dark with his hands at his sides, the same way he had stood by my window on the fire road east of the Kellerman farm. He had been on his feet for a while. I could tell from the way he was carrying himself. I stepped back and let him in. He came inside and stood near the edge of the workbench without touching anything. His eyes went to the county map immediately, the way a person's eyes go to something familiar in an unfamiliar room. He looked at it for a moment. Then he reached across the bench and put his finger on a location in the eastern section, about 12 miles from where we were standing, on a dirt road that ran behind the old property lines off Route 9. "I have been here," he said. "They held me one night in this building. The first time I tried to leave, before I got away. Tell me about it." I said. He described it from memory, the way a person describes a place they did not stay in willingly, with the kind of specific, unadorned detail that comes from paying close attention to a space you need to escape from. An old two-story structure, probably built in the 1950s, set back far enough from the road that you could not see it from a passing vehicle. Two entrances, one at the front and one at the back of the ground floor. The stairs to the second floor were at the interior back wall. The second floor had 3 rooms. They kept people in the middle one. He said the windows on the second floor had been boarded from the outside. I asked him how he had found me at the shop. He said Miss Margaret had told him, a long time ago, that if something happened and he needed help, he should find the man who owned Holloway Repair. He had remembered that. After I had come to the farm that morning, Esteban had waited until dark and walked to the shop. He had watched from the tree line until he was sure I was alone. I thought about that for a moment. Margaret had prepared for the possibility of her own disappearance in a dozen different ways, routing her instructions through people like Esteban, through Clara, through the USB in the truck, through the note in the envelope. She had thought about every contingency, except the one where I would refuse to wait for someone else to fix it. I told him what I needed him to do. I needed him to stay at the shop. I needed him to keep his phone on. When I called him, he was going to call the GBI number that Clara had given me, and he was going to tell them everything he knew about the building on that road. He nodded once without hesitating. "I go with you," he said. I shook my head. I said, "No. You go with me, and 2 of us get caught instead of 1. He thought about that for a moment, then he nodded again. I gave him the number Clara had given me and made him repeat it back twice until I was certain he had it. I went through the shop and put together what I needed. Not a soldier's kit, a mechanic's kit. A short pry bar I used for removing stuck exhaust components. A coil of 1/4-inch nylon rope from the shelf above the tire storage. A small LED flashlight I used for working in tight engine spaces. A folding knife from the lower left drawer. I wrapped the items in a shop rag and set them beside the rifle. Then I sat down at the workbench and drew the building layout from what Esteban had told me, marking the 2 entrances, the interior stairwell, the middle room on the second floor. I worked slowly and got it right. When I was done, I folded the drawing and put it in my shirt pocket. I had not fought anyone since I was in the service, and I was not planning to fight anyone now. The plan was not to overwhelm. The plan was to open a door and walk Margaret out of it and get to the truck before anyone could organize a response. Before I left, I stopped in the kitchen. There was a photograph on the side of the refrigerator, held there by a magnet Margaret had bought at a farmer's market 2 summers ago. The photo was from last April, taken in the garden behind the house. Margaret was kneeling by the tomato plants, looking up at the camera with a smile that I had not tried to photograph or preserve or even think about too hard, because I had assumed it would always just be there. I had not told Margaret I was proud of her in a very long time. I had not thought to say it because I had not known, until this week, the full scope of what she had been doing. I looked at the photo for a moment, and then I went out to the truck. I drove east through Millhaven with the windows down and the town quiet around me, past the diner, past the hardware store, past Grace Baptist where we had buried Danny. I drove until the houses thinned out and the fields opened up on either side, and the road ahead was dark. About 2 miles from the location Esteban had marked. I turned off the headlights. I had driven enough dark roads in my life to know how to read the pavement by the light of the sky. I slowed down and let the truck move forward on its own, guided by the shape of the tree line against the stars. The building was somewhere up ahead in the dark. So was Margaret. The last 2 miles to the building were the longest 2 miles I had driven in recent memory, not in distance, in everything else. The road was narrow, and the tree canopy pressed in from both sides, and the truck rolled through the dark the way something moves when it is trying not to be noticed. I kept my speed to a crawl. The engine made almost no sound at all. The night around me was full of the things that live in it. The click of insects. The occasional distant sound of something moving through the underbrush. The kind of Georgia night that has been going on exactly like this since long before any of the people in it were born. I thought about Margaret. I thought about the first time I had seen her. At a church social I had only attended because my mother had asked me twice. Margaret had been 23 years old, and she had been helping set up folding tables, and she had laughed at something the woman next to her said, in a way that made every other sound in the room seem less important. I had asked someone who she was. I had made a point of introducing myself before I left. We had been married the following spring in the backyard of her father's house, in a ceremony that lasted about 20 minutes and was attended by 30 people and was, without question, the best 20 minutes of my life up to that point and probably since. 24 years of mornings. 24 years of starting her truck before she was out of bed. Of the coffee she made the way I liked it without ever being asked. Of the way she called my name when she wanted my attention. Not loud, just a particular way of saying it that I had never heard her use for anyone else. I had a lot of things I'd been planning to say to Margaret when I found her. At some point in the last 2 days, that list had gotten very short. There were really only 2 things left on it. The first was her name. The second was that I was proud of her. I thought about Danny. I had spent the drive from the shop carrying the anger about Danny's death the way I had been carrying it for 2 days, like a weight I could not set down. But somewhere in those last 2 miles something shifted in it. The truth about how Danny had died was terrible. It would always be terrible. But it had not changed anything about who Danny was. He had still been the boy with the serious way about him. He had still laughed his mother's laugh. He had still asked me about the rifle with his arms folded in the doorway, hoping that day would never come. What Harlan had done to him was a crime that would be answered for. But it had not reached back through time and unmade a single hour of the 19 years Danny had lived. I was going to have to hold on to that. Danny had been 19 years old on the day he died, and he had been exactly who he was supposed to be. No version of how he died could change that. I was carrying that into the dark with me, and I intended to bring it back out. I thought about Pete, not with the anger I had expected to feel about him. With something more like sorrow for the way the world builds men like Harlan by giving them power over situations that strip ordinary men down to their worst possible choices. Pete had loved his son the way a father is supposed to love a son. He had just been unlucky enough to be in the path of someone who knew how to use that love against him. That did not excuse what he had done. But I had been carrying the anger at Pete since I drove away from his house, and I realized somewhere in those last dark miles that it was weight I did not need to carry into what came next. I pulled the truck off the road and into a gap in the tree line, about 300 yards from where Esteban had marked the building. I turned off the engine. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the sound of my own breathing. I sat in that silence for a moment. Then I got out of the truck. I moved through the field on foot, staying low and close to the tree line. The ground was uneven under the long grass, the kind of terrain that will turn an ankle if you are not paying attention. I went slowly. Speed was not what this required. This required not being heard. The building resolved out of the dark ahead of me. A darker shape against a dark sky, with the yellow edge of light visible around the boards on one of the second-floor windows. Someone was awake in there. More than one person, from the number of vehicles I could make out near the front of the structure. I circled to the back and found the rear entrance Esteban had described. Then I moved around to the side of the building and found a position below the second-floor window where I could see the edge of the room through a gap in the boards. I could see Margaret. She was sitting in a chair against the far wall, her wrists bound behind her, a cut above her right eye that had dried dark. But her head was up. She was not slumped. Whatever had happened to her in the hours since Friday night had not reached whatever part of her had decided to stay upright. I heard a door open somewhere above me. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor of the room. A shadow crossed the gap in the boards. Boyd Harlan stood in the light, looking down at Margaret, saying something I could not hear through the wood. I checked my watch. 11:14 in the evening. It was time. The rear entrance was where Esteban had told me it would be. An old wooden door with hinges that had not been oiled in years, and a padlock looped through the hasp but not locked. Someone had been going in and out and had not bothered to secure it behind them. I stood in the dark outside that door for what was probably 3 minutes, but felt longer. Long enough to slow my breathing down. Long enough to listen to what was on the other side of it. The building was not quiet. There were voices somewhere on the ground floor, 2 of them, coming from the direction of the front of the structure. They were not agitated voices. They were the voices of men who had been waiting a long time and had settled into the long, boring part of whatever this was. I went in. The ground floor was what Esteban had said. It would be open space, old equipment, the kind of debris that accumulates in any abandoned structure over decades. I moved to the far corner of the room and waited while my eyes adjusted to the interior dark. The first man came past the doorway at the end of the ground floor about 2 minutes later. He was checking his phone, not watching where he was going, and he walked within 4 feet of me without turning his head in my direction. I let him pass. Then I followed him into the side room. What happened next was not a fight. I am 62 years old, and I have not been in a fight since I was a young man. And I did not have the illusion that I could prevail against a man likely half my age in any kind of fair contest. What I had instead was the pry bar from my shop bag, 4 decades of understanding how mechanical systems work, and the knowledge that the back of a human skull is a very particular kind of lever point when struck correctly. He went down without making a sound. I tied his wrists with a section of the rope, left him on his side in the back of the room, and found the second man at the front of the building by following the faint glow of another phone screen. He was facing away from me, looking out a boarded window, and the floorboards in that section of the building were soft enough that my footsteps produced almost nothing. I waited until he turned slightly to look at his phone again. Then I closed the remaining distance. He was heavier than the first one, but the result was the same. I tied him and left him in the corner. After that, I found the interior stairwell where Esteban had told me to look, at the back wall of the ground floor, and I went up. The stairs were old and tight, and I tested each one before putting my weight on it. It took me longer than I wanted. At the top, I stopped and listened. Harlan's voice was somewhere down the hall. The low, deliberate voice of a man who was not raising it because he did not need to. I could not make out the words, but I knew the voice. I moved to the middle door and put my hand on the knob. I opened it. Margaret was exactly where I had seen her through the gap in the boards, in the chair, wrists bound behind her, the dried cut above her right eye. She looked up when the door opened, and for a fraction of a second, her face did what a face does when it is not sure whether what it is seeing is real. Then she said, "I knew you'd come." I crossed the room and got behind the chair and cut the rope at her wrists with the folding knife. Her hands fell forward, and she brought them around slowly, working the circulation back. I checked the cut on her forehead. The skin was intact. The damage was surface level. She had a bruise along her left cheekbone that was going to take time but was not serious. "You always did know me better than I know myself," I said. Something that was almost a smile moved across her face. It was the same smile she had been giving me for 24 years when I said something that was true but came out sideways. The same one from the photograph on the refrigerator. The same one I had been trying to get back to since Friday night. I helped her up. She was unsteady on her feet, the way a person gets after sitting with restricted circulation for too long. And she held my arm for a moment until her legs decided to cooperate. I picked up the shop bag with my other hand. Then we heard them. Footsteps, not hurried. Not the footsteps of a man who has heard something that alarmed him. The footsteps of a man moving through his own space in his own time, coming down the hall toward this room because this was part of his regular circuit, not because anything had changed. I looked at Margaret. She looked at the door. It opened. Boyd Harlan stood in the doorway with a gun held low at his side and his eyes moving between me and Margaret with the calm, measuring quality of a man who is running calculations, not reacting to a surprise. He stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. He did not rush any of it. He looked at me the way he had looked at me on the road the night I called him about Margaret, with that quality of complete control that I had always interpreted as strength and now understood as something else entirely. "Ray Holloway," he said. "I have to say, I'm impressed." He stood between us and the door. His voice was exactly as steady as it had been the night he put his hand on my shoulder on Old Creek Road and promised me he would find my wife and bring her home. The rifle was up before I had consciously made the decision to raise it. I had brought it in with me, slung across my back, and when Harlan stepped inside and closed the door, I had it in my hands and pointed in his direction, without being entirely sure when the transition had happened. Harlan looked at it without flinching. He was a man who had been around firearms for the length of his career, and the sight of one did not alter the basic arithmetic of the way he held himself in a room. He looked at me the way he always looked at people, like a problem he was solving. He said, "You are not going to shoot me, Ray." I said nothing. He said, "I know you. You are an accountant. You fix trucks. You are not the kind of man who shoots someone in cold blood." He paused. "And even if you were, the moment you pulled that trigger, everything you have spent the last 2 days building toward gets complicated in ways that do not favor you or your wife." He said, Your wife is alive. Whatever you found on that drive, you can still walk out of here with her. But only if you stop thinking about that rifle as a solution and start thinking about it as a complication. Margaret was behind me, her hand resting against my back, the way a person places their hand on something solid when they need to stay upright. I did not lower the rifle. Harlan looked at me for another moment. Then something changed in his face. Not the expression itself. Something underneath it. A small, deliberate recalculation. He knew the GBI had been contacted. He knew that much. What he did not know yet was how much time he had before they acted on it. He was trying to figure out where the leverage was. The way Harlan always worked, methodically, without showing the work. He said, "Let me ask you something. Have you thought about what happened on Cedar Road? Not the report, not the photographs. The actual morning." I said nothing. He said, "Your boy was out there for a few minutes before I arrived. He had a phone and he had photographs and he knew something was wrong. He tried to call someone. I thought you should know that. He tried. I was aware of my own breathing. I was aware of Margaret's hand against my back." Harlan said, "He called out for you, right at the end, on Cedar Road. Did you know that he was asking for you? He let that sit in the air of the room the way a man lets something sit when he knows it will spread. He was not saying it because it was true or because it was false. He was saying it because he had identified the lever point the same way I had identified lever points all my working life. And he was applying pressure to it with the steady, clinical precision of a man who understood that everyone has a place where they will break if you push correctly. I felt the rage move through me the way I imagine a fissure moves through concrete. Not slowly, all at once. Every morning, Danny had come down the stairs in his work boots and poured himself a cup of coffee and said, "See you tonight, Dad," without looking up from his phone. Every single morning for the last 2 years before Cedar Road. The last one. I had been under the truck in the driveway when he left, and I had heard his truck back out, and I had not come out to say goodbye, because I had assumed there would be another morning. I had assumed there would be another morning, and there had not been. And I had carried that assumption turned absence for 8 years. Every single day. It had not grown lighter. You get better at carrying the weight, but the weight does not change. Nothing about learning the truth of what had happened changed that particular weight either. It was still the same weight. It was always going to be the same weight. I thought about all the mornings I would have traded anything to have back. Margaret said my name. Just my name. Ray. Nothing else. I stood there with the rifle raised and the rage fully present, and a man standing in front of me who had killed my son. And I understood what Harlan was doing. He needed me to act on the rage. He needed me to pull the trigger or lower the rifle and come at him, or do any of the things that grief-maddened men do when someone takes away the last restraint. Because any of those things would end the careful, methodical plan that had been built over the last 2 days and replace it with chaos that he could work with. And I realized something in that moment. Something about the kind of man Boyd Harlan was. He was not afraid of me. He was not afraid of Margaret. He was not afraid of the GBI, not yet. The only thing he was afraid of was a version of this where everything he had built stayed intact. And he was trying to engineer that version in real time. Using the most efficient tool he had left the name of my dead son. I thought about Danny asking about the rifle in the bedroom doorway. Hope that day never comes. Dad. Me too. Son. I had said. Me too. I lowered the rifle. Harlan blinked. I had never seen Boyd Harlan lose his composure. Not once in 16 years. Not at the county fair or at church or at my son's funeral. He had never flinched at anything I had ever done or said. For one fraction of a second. In a dark room in the middle of the night with everything falling apart around him, he had blinked. It was the first involuntary thing I had ever seen him do. I looked at him and I said, "My son's name was Danny, and you don't get to use it." The moment I lowered the rifle. Harlan moved. Not fast. He was not a man who moved fast. He took 2 steps toward me with the gun coming up at his side, calculating, the way a man calculates when he has just seen an opening that might not stay open. I put my hand in my pocket and took out my phone and called Esteban's number. 1 ring, 2, then Esteban's voice, low and careful. "Now," I said. Then I put the phone back in my pocket and looked at Harlan. He had stopped. His eyes went from me to the phone and back to me with the fast, involuntary movement of a man doing math he does not like the answers to. I started talking. I told him what was on the USB drive. Not everything. Enough. The financial records going back 6 years. The names of the county commissioner and the state road inspector and the chief of the agricultural board, all of whom had been receiving payments from accounts connected to the Kellerman operation. The maintenance records for the flatbed trucks, traced by plate number to holding companies that could be connected to Harlan's personal finances with approximately 2 hours of work by anyone who knew what they were looking at. The photographs, the timeline Margaret had compiled in her handwriting, laying out the sequence of events from the night Danny had died, all the way to the present. I told him all of it had been in the hands of the GBI for approximately 8 hours. Harlan listened. Something changed in him as I talked. It was not a dramatic change. It was the kind of change you see in a structure when the foundation shifts. Not a collapse. A settling that tells you the collapse is coming. He had spent 16 years building something in this county. He had used the authority that voters gave him to construct an operation that, from a certain angle, could be called impressive in its scope and patience. He had believed, I think, that he had built it well enough that it would survive anything short of a catastrophe. He was looking at the catastrophe. I watched him work through it. I watched him try to find the thread to pull that would unravel what I had just told him, the angle that made it survivable. I could see it in his face. There was no thread. He moved. It was not a lunge. It was a step, deliberate and committed. The gun coming up. The decision made. A man who had run out of other options, making the one move he had left. The lights came through the boarded windows first, 3 vehicles, by the spread of the light. Then the sound of them on the gravel outside. Then voices and radio static and boots on the ground floor below us. Harlan turned toward the door. The door opened before he reached it. I do not know exactly how many GBI agents came into that room. More than 2. Fewer than 10. What I know is that Boyd Harlan, who had run this county for 16 years, who had put his hand on my shoulder at my son's funeral and promised me he was one of the good ones, went down onto the floor of that second-story room with his hands behind his back, and when they put the cuffs on him and lifted him to his feet, he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. I did not say anything. I turned and walked over to Margaret. The GBI agents had things to do, and they did them. Margaret and I made our way down the stairs and out the rear entrance, and we sat down on the low concrete step at the back of the building and waited for the ambulance that one of them had called. The night had gone very still. Whatever wind there had been earlier was gone. The fields around the building were dark and quiet, and above us the Georgia sky was full of stars, the way it gets in the deep country on a clear night. More stars than the sky seems like it should be able to hold. Margaret put her head on my shoulder. I sat there and let the silence work on me for a while. It did something to my chest that I did not have a word for. Not relief. Exactly. Relief is the absence of pressure. This was something else. Something more like the return of a sound that had been missing for so long. You had stopped noticing the silence where it used to be. I had been operating on adrenaline and necessity for the better part of 2 days, and the quiet of that step was the first time I had sat still long enough for my body to realize what the last 48 hours had required of it. I was not alone anymore. That was the simplest version of it. After a while, I asked her the question I had been carrying since I first saw that folder on the USB drive and had not been able to bring myself to open. "How long have you known about Danny?" Margaret lifted her head from my shoulder and looked at me. The light from the building was behind her, and I could not see her face clearly. But I knew the way her face looked when she was measuring something. Measuring whether a person was ready. Measuring what it would cost them to hear the true answer. She said, 3 years. The stars were still there. The fields were still dark. Everything around us was exactly the same as it had been 15 seconds before. But the question I had been carrying for 3 days was answered. And the answer was not what I had prepared myself for. And I sat on that step beside my wife in the Georgia night and stayed very still while I worked out what to do with it. We sat on the front steps of the building while the GBI moved inside. Margaret had a blanket around her shoulders that one of the agents had given her. Her wrists were marked from the rope. The bruise along her left cheekbone had gone dark. She was sitting straight, both hands folded in her lap, looking out at the gravel lot in the way of someone whose mind has been running hard for a long time and has only now begun to slow. I sat beside her. I did not know what to say, so I said nothing. We had been married long enough that silence between us did not require filling. After a while, she told me she had found the information about Danny 3 years ago. She had been working through a set of financial records tied to one of Harlan's private accounts when she came across a cash withdrawal on a date that matched the morning Danny had died. A payment from an off-book fund. She had spent 4 months confirming it. 4 months working alone at the kitchen table after I had gone to sleep. I asked her why she had not told me. She looked at me for a long moment before she answered. She said she had known immediately what I would do. She had understood the second she saw that date on that record exactly how it would go if I found out. She had sat with it for 4 months, and in the end, the only reason she had kept it from me was that she was not willing to lose me the same way she had lost Danny. She said I already lost him. I was not going to let Harlan take you too. I had the evidence. I had a path that ended with him in a cell and Danny's name in the record. I gave you more mornings instead. I did not answer her. I've thought about that moment many times in the months since, trying to figure out what I actually felt. And the best I can do is this: I was not angry. I understand that might be hard to believe, but I was not. I was sitting on those steps beside the woman I had built my entire adult life around, and for the first time, I was seeing the full length of what she was capable of carrying on behalf of the life we shared. There are some things you cannot argue with. You can only recognize them for what they are. I put my arm around her and held on until the paramedics came. And after that, I sat in the back of an ambulance and held her hand all the way to Millhaven General. Harlan was arraigned 11 days later. At the hearing, he sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at the wall above the judge's head, like none of it had anything to do with him. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. The trial took 3 weeks. The GBI had the financial records, the photographs, the testimony of 11 workers Harlan had brought in and held against their will, the USB drive, and a cooperating witness named Pete Dawson, who told the court everything he had passed to Harlan over 4 years in exchange for his son's drug charges being buried. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Harlan was convicted on 41 counts. The sentence was 47 years. He would not leave prison alive. Kellerman entered a plea and cooperated in exchange for reduced charges, which led to 2 other farm operators in adjacent counties being prosecuted in a federal case that followed in the spring. Esteban was called as a witness. He testified without a translator. His English had been steady all along. He just had not had a reason to use it in front of people who had the power to determine what happened to him. Pete Dawson's testimony was entered into the record. The charges against his son Jimmy were reviewed and dropped on procedural grounds. Pete sold his half of the shop back to me for $1 and moved to Savannah to be near Jimmy. He called me once before he left. I let it go to voicemail. I have not listened to the message. I am not sure I ever will. Clara Webb's piece ran in a regional magazine 6 weeks after the trial ended. It covered the full scope of what Harlan had built over 11 years. The network of farms, the men and women he had moved through the county like inventory, and the murder of a 19-year-old named Daniel Ray Holloway on a September morning 8 years ago on Cedar Road. It was the first time Danny's name had appeared in print since his obituary. I read it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning. The piece ran to 4,000 words. I read every one of them. And when I finished, I folded the magazine closed and set it in front of me and sat with it for a while. I thought about Danny, about a photograph taken at the wrong time on the wrong road and what it had cost him, about a boy who had my hands and his mother's laugh. and about what it means when a good thing done by a good person in the wrong place gets noticed by the wrong man, about how thin that line is, about how it has always been thin, and how most people never know. I thought about Margaret, about 3 years of carrying something that heavy alone, because she had decided she was not willing to risk losing me. I had been married to her for 24 years, and I had thought I knew the full shape of who she was. I had thought I could read her the way you read a road you have driven 1,000 times. I had not even been close. I sat in the quiet of the kitchen, and I did not have words for what I felt. I still do not. Some things sit outside of language, and you learn over time to leave them there. I got up and went out to the garage. On the Saturday morning that Clara's piece ran, I was already in the garage before Margaret was out of bed. That was not unusual for me. I had been waking early for most of my adult life. But that morning I was there for a reason I had not been aware of consciously, until I found myself standing next to her truck in the gray pre-dawn light with the key in my hand. I opened the hood and checked the oil and the coolant and the belt tension the way I had done 10,000 times over the years on vehicles I cared about. Then I got in, turned the key, and let the engine idle until the temperature gauge settled into the range where Margaret would be comfortable on her way to wherever she was going. I had done this every morning for 24 years, every single one. Rain, cold, the middle of winter, the middle of summer. She had never asked me to. I had never announced I was doing it. It had just become part of how I moved through my days. This small thing I did for her that cost me almost nothing and had accumulated, over the years, into something I could not have named but recognized as the shape of a marriage. I sat in her truck with the engine running and thought about the man I had been 6 weeks ago. A mechanic who fixed trucks and went home and ate dinner and watched the news and assumed he understood his own life. I thought about all the things that had been happening right across from him at that kitchen table, carried in the face of the woman who sat there every morning, completely invisible because she had decided to carry them invisibly so that he could go on having ordinary mornings. I thought God gives certain people an extraordinary capacity for love, and those people almost never announce it. They just show up every day and carry what needs to be carried and let the people they love believe that everything is fine. Margaret had been doing that for 30 years. I got out of the truck and left the engine running and walked back to the door of the garage and waited. She came out about 20 minutes later. She was moving easily now, the bruises gone. The cut above her eye faded to nothing the way the doctor had said it would. She was carrying her bag and her jacket and her reading glasses, and she had the look she always had in the mornings, which was the look of a person whose mind has already started working on whatever the day requires. She saw me standing at the garage door, and she stopped. She looked at the truck, the plume of exhaust in the cold morning air, the engine running. Then she looked at me. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She just looked at me the way you look at someone when you want them to understand that you see them. All of them. The full shape of who they are. I looked back at her the same way. I have thought about what I saw in that moment, and the best I can do is this: I saw a woman who had loved me at some cost to herself for 3 decades, who had made choices on my behalf that I had not known to be grateful for, who had decided, apparently, that none of that required acknowledgement or credit. I saw somebody who was completely at peace with having given more than she would ever receive in return, because the giving was its own sufficient thing. I thought, God, how do you become that? How does a person get to the place where they can do that? And then I thought, she has been showing you every morning for 30 years. You just had to learn to see it. Margaret smiled at me. It was the same smile from the photograph on the refrigerator, the same one from the garden, the same one from every morning at the kitchen table. She got in the truck and drove to work. I stood in the doorway of the garage and watched her go. And I stayed there until the truck was gone and the street was quiet again, and the morning had turned from gray to gold the way mornings do in Georgia in the autumn. I have started her truck every morning since. I am not a hero. I want to be clear about that. I am 62 years old, and I am a mechanic with a bad back and a truck that burns oil and 24 years of knowing how to start a car before anybody else is awake. I did one difficult thing when the situation required it. That was all. But God made the world in such a way that sometimes the most important things you will ever learn about the people you love are the things you were never supposed to find out. And when you find them out, if you are paying attention and if you have any sense at all, you stop taking the ordinary mornings for granted. The people sitting across from you at your kitchen table right now, the ones you think you know completely, the ones whose faces you can read like a road you have driven 1,000 times. They are carrying things. Not necessarily the things Margaret carried, but something. Everybody carries something. Look at them. Really look. Whatever they are carrying, they have been carrying it right in front of you all along. If this story meant something to you today, share it with someone who might need it. Leave a comment with the city you are watching from, and follow along for more stories like this one. I was not a hero, but I was married to one, and I just didn't know it.